As the shadows of World War II receded, and the world grappled with the aftermath of one of the deadliest conflicts in history, the fate of Adolf Hitler's remains became a subject shrouded in mystery and speculation. While the war concluded in 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, the story of what transpired after Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, at the Führer bunker in Berlin is steeped in secrecy, espionage, and a cat-and-mouse game involving some of the most powerful nations of the post-war era. At the heart of the final hours of the Third Reich was a chaotic and frantic atmosphere. Hitler's decision to take his own life reflected not only a personal desire to evade capture, but a recognition of the imminent collapse of Nazi ideology. As the Red Army encircled Berlin, the very epicenter of Nazi power, the streets were filled with the cacophony of gunfire and the distant rumblings of Soviet artillery. In the bunker, a parallel reality unfolded, a reality overflowing with men of influence who were already attempting to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout that had consumed Germany. As Hitler and Eva Braun took their final moments together, they decided on a grim exit strategy, a double suicide followed by the incineration of their bodies to avoid the Nazis' remains falling into enemy hands. This decision would ultimately kickstart a series of events involving not only Hitler's body, but also the remnants of the regime's possessions, strategies, and attempts to conceal their past, echoing throughout the subsequent Cold War tensions. When Hitler and Braun ended their lives, their bodies were swiftly carried outside the bunker by their remaining loyalists, officials who were instructed to follow Hitler's final request. After dousing the remains with petrol, they ignited them amid the burning wreckage of the Reich Chancellery's garden. However, the execution of this act was far from the secretive maneuver Hitler envisioned. The Soviet forces, now immersed in the final assault on Berlin, had eyes and ears on the ground. The remains were discovered, partially burned and unrecognizable. Yet, the Soviets' immediate priority was not merely the confirmation of Hitler's demise, it was what the man symbolized. To the Soviet command, mired in decades of ideological rivalry with the fascist ideologies of the Nazis, the retrieval of Hitler's body became a matter of national pride and propaganda. As Moscow closed its grip on triumphant narratives, the question of what to do with the body became contentious. Red Army soldiers had retrieved the remains within mere hours of their incineration, but faced an intricate web of decisions arising from political implications. With the dawn of the Cold War looming, the need for discretion grew paramount. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin recognized the potential value in controlling the narrative surrounding Hitler's death, a narrative that could be used to solidify communism's ideological righteousness against fascism. In a series of almost clandestine operations, the remains were carefully exhumed, transported, and ultimately subjected to extensive forensic examination conducted by Soviet specialists tasked with confirming the identity of Hitler for the annals of history. As the frantic post-war atmosphere enveloped Europe in uncertainty, the Soviet military intelligence apparatus, known as SMERSH, took charge of the investigation. Using a mix of military precision and paranoia, they consolidated a facade of control over the remains, while simultaneously initiating a campaign aimed at erasing the physical vestiges of the Nazi regime. The challenge lay not only in maintaining secrecy, but also in the logistics of the operation itself. As Moscow strategized, the Soviet Union was in the throes of establishing itself as a global superpower, and any misstep could shake the foundations of their burgeoning influence. In early May 1945, plans were rapidly conceived to transport the remains to a location where they could be completely eliminated from sight. A clandestine team of officers and doctors engaged in the grim task of dissection, with chillingly detached professionalism, seeking to ascertain definitive proof of Hitler's death while simultaneously disposing of the body in a way that could not be speculated upon later. Ultimately, the remains were burned again, reduced to ashes, and deposited in the Elbe River in Germany. The audacity of this operation bore an unmistakable imprint of Cold War sensibilities, revealing the lengths to which the Soviet Union would go to control narratives. By obliterating the body, The USSR not only sought to quell potential neo-fascist movements, but simultaneously reinforced the image of a national triumph over one of history's most malevolent figures. Like an artist painting over a canvas, the Soviets rewrote history as they proceeded to construct their own version of events, one that would influence generations to come. Yet, the impact of such actions extended beyond mere politics. The human consequences behind the imbroglio surrounding Hitler's remains personified the deep wounds left on a fractured populace. As the war's end shifted global dynamics, those who had fought or suffered under Nazi rule grappled with the moral ambiguities of vengeance, justice, and the desire for accountability. Survivors of the Holocaust, former resistance fighters, and ordinary citizens found themselves after the conflict bearing witness to a complex tapestry of loss and anger. The very act of disposing of Hitler's remains became emblematic of a failed reckoning. Without the public act of denouncing his physical form, there lingered an unsettling ambiguity that allowed far-right ideologies to fester in the shadows, unchallenged and unaccountable. In the end, the traumatic passage of Hitler's body ceased to be solely a logistical endeavor. It was an act reflective of the broader tumult of a world reshaping itself post-war. Emerging from the darkness of conflict and horror, the pursuit of truth would encounter yet another layer of testimony as political narratives clashed with the haunting memories of millions. The post-war period was rife with both hope and despair, leading nations to confront the consequences of war, oftentimes ignoring the thorny realities that surfaced from the abyss of totalitarianism. As intricate geopolitical maneuvering took root, the history of Hitler's demise, a subject cloaked in layers of secrecy, continued to influence perceptions for decades, forever etching its lessons into geopolitical textbooks and personal histories alike. What happened to Hitler's body was no ordinary episode. It was a multifaceted story that intertwined the fate of nations, the echoes of past traumas, and the relentless pursuit of moral clarity in an uncertain world, a perpetually dark symphony of war's aftermath. As the final days of the Third Reich dawned, the chaos of war found its way into the very heart of Berlin. Amidst the crumbling edifices and the cacophony of distant artillery, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle navigated the paradox of power and impotence. In those ephemeral moments of desperation, with the Red Army encircling the city, the tactical maneuvers of the German military grew increasingly as erratic as the political decisions being made by the Führer himself. The fall of Berlin was not merely a military defeat. It represented the culmination of decades of national fervor, tailspinned into delirious zealotry, culminating in a harrowing collision with reality that left a ruptured society in its wake. The unprecedented shift in military strategy focused on a disjointed defense. Units were chronically short of soldiers and supplies, while the war's toll wreaked havoc on morale. Rather than a coordinated front, desperate measures were taken, such as the use of child soldiers and the mobilization of the Hitler Youth, whose inexperience in warfare only further compromised the already crumbling German defenses. In this theater of despair, where defeat became inevitable, the Second World War's bitter conclusion would forever resonate within the human experience. With Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied troops closing in from the west, the city became an open cauldron of treachery, already unraveling at the seams. Knowing that capture was imminent, Hitler's inner circle made choices that would shape history's narrative. A significant pivot point of this period was the infamous Führer bunker, concealed beneath the Reich Chancellery. It became a claustrophobic arena for last-ditch strategizing and a grim testament to Hitler's unwillingness to accept defeat. The almost ritualistic discussions held within its concrete walls highlighted the insanity that enveloped the remnants of the Nazi leadership. Military generals, ideologically driven party loyalists, and Hitler's increasingly desperate plans intertwined in a surreal blend of delusion and tragic heroism, as artillery shells rattled the structure, reverberating the palpable sense of impending doom. Hitler made the final decision to end his life. On April 30, 1945, history witnessed the agonizing culmination of a regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich, yet collapsed in a matter of days, in a dwindling sea of insanity. But as the dust settled over Berlin, and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the annals of time, the complexities surrounding the disposal of Hitler's body emerged like a shadow over the ruins. Following his suicide, a desperate act that was equal parts cowardice and reluctance to face the consequences of his reign, the personnel in attendance, including Eva Braun and several loyal officials, sought to ensure that his physical form would not become a trophy for the victors. Human instinct intertwined with ideology. The fear that his remains would serve as a rallying point for those still devoted to his ideals led to a hasty decision-making process in the final moments of the regime's life cycle. Hitler's body, along with that of Braun, was doused in petrol and set aflame, an act intended to erase his legacy from the physical realm and to deny his followers a tangible relic around which they could regroup and inspire delight in their fallen leader. This visceral conclusion to a monstrous chapter in history was fraught with its own challenges, as the act of incineration, witnessed only by a select few, bore far-reaching implications both for the victors and the vanquished. The logistical feat of securing such remains proved to be as tumultuous as the decisions leading up to it. The charred remains, hastily buried in the rubble of Berlin, faced an uncertain fate in the immediate aftermath of the war. With the impending arrival of Soviet forces, there was a fear that details surrounding the act of disposal could be lost to history if proper records weren't established. Initially, Soviet troops uncovered the remains, leading to speculative conjectures and strategic manipulations in a broader contest for information supremacy between the Allies and the USSR. As the Cold War commenced, the narratives woven through the retelling of Hitler's final moments transformed the nature of historical discourse. Immediately, the mantle of authority regarding the remains fell into Soviet hands. Under Stalin's regime, the retrieval and eventual autopsy of Hitler's body would become a top-secret endeavor, matched only by grand political machinations. Emerging from the rubble, the Soviets sought not merely the horrid truth behind Hitler's demise, but also pieces of intelligence that would prove valuable in their campaign of retribution against the remnants of fascism. Analyzing what was left of Hitler's body provided them with a distorted perspective on the capabilities of the Nazis, contributing further to their sweeping narrative aimed at obliterating such ideologies. This investigational quest became a dual-edged sword, as it played upon the sentiments of a bloodied nation while simultaneously silencing dissent within the ranks, ensuring that the image of evil was tied irrevocably to Hitler himself, an ideological anchor to bolster the communist narrative. The subsequent secrecy surrounding the remains became a scenario not dissimilar to a legendary artifact locked away in a vault. To a generation painfully aware of the scars left by the war, the idea that Hitler's remains were sequestered within a cabinet in the bowels of the Soviet Union led to burgeoning conspiracy theories. The average citizen, bereft of knowledge of the geopolitical chess games being played, began to speculate wildly about the fate of his corpse. While the fear of a resurgence of fascist sentiment gripped the nations affected by the war, the lack of transparency surrounding the remains stoked the fires of conspiracy. Was Hitler alive? Had he escaped? Political factions flourished in the shadows, feeding off of the mistrust sown during and after the war, as much as the public's endless fascination with the notorious figure of history. What was meant to be an act of closure became a festering wound. Without closure, the specter of Hitler would hold a resounding power over a continent battling the duality of ideology and reconciliation. The absence of a definitive conclusion regarding his remains, humans was once again brought into stark relief the consequences of war, not merely on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of the people who lived through it. The complexities of the world shaped by the aftermath demanded a grappling with both the reality of human depravity seen in the Holocaust and the quest for accountability from future generations steeped in moral reflection. The story of Hitler's body, rather than fading into the annals of history, remains etched into a collective memory that continues to shape socio-political landscapes, as leaders, thinkers, and average citizens alike wrestle with the ramifications of a war that begot horror on an unprecedented scale. As the echoes of war persist in modern times, one cannot help but reflect upon the lessons imparted by history. Our understanding of international relations, national identities, and the capacity for human resilience in the face of unearthly adversity. The fragile balance between power, accountability, and memory endures as dialogue deepens on the nature of evil, the allure of totalitarianism, and the perennial quest for peace. As our understandings evolve, we encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections on this profound historical enigma. Join us in contributing to the dialogue, subscribe and leave your comments, for it is through communication that we may learn from the past and strive for a brighter future. In the chaotic final days of World War II, as the Allied forces steadily advanced into Berlin, Adolf Hitler's life neared its tragic conclusion. The deteriorating situation for the Third Reich left Hitler cornered in a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, a stronghold that had once served as the seat of power but was now encircled by the advancing Soviet army. The political and military dilemmas faced by the Nazis during these final moments unfolded dramatically, impacting not only the individuals involved, but also the broader narrative of the war and its aftermath. Hitler's military strategies, characterized by grandiose miscalculations and stubborn refusal to accept the reality of defeat, directly contributed to the disintegration of German morale on all levels. Military commanders, soldiers, and civilians alike faced a disheartening inevitability. As the Red Army closed in, emblazoned with the banner of vengeance, historical inevitability collided with the deeply personal decision-making processes that shaped the end for Hitler and his inner circle. The tactical landscape in Berlin shifted radically as the Soviets launched their final assault. The Battle of Berlin, commencing on April 16, 1945, turned the city into a cauldron of violence and desperation. Coordinated plans were abandoned as the chaotic nature of defense overtook German command structures. Hitler, isolated in his bunker and increasingly disconnected from the realities unfurling outside, made frantic decisions that only accelerated the Reich's demise. Orders to deploy reserves, reconfigure defensive postures, and fortify key positions resulted simply in further losses, both in men and material, as the age-old tenets of warfare collided with an enemy revered for its methodical execution and determination. On the one hand, Hitler instructed desperate measures. On the other, his subordinates confronted insurmountable odds. When the Soviets infiltrated Berlin's outskirts, the command and communication infrastructure within the Axis forces crumbled, reminiscent of the collapse witnessed during World War I. The sense of inevitable defeat permeated every echelon, fracturing the spirit of German resistance. Amidst this cataclysm, personal tragedies unfolded with equal weight. Within the subterranean walls of the bunker, Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, marked the culmination of both his glorious ambition and fearful nihilism. His decision, a final escape from facing accountability, resonated cruelly within the vortex of destruction. It sparked a devastating chain reaction among those in the bunker, where family ties, loyalty, and fear intermingled in harrowing ways. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, joined him in death, highlighting the personal dimensions of loyalty among the Führer's inner circle. The narrative of militaristic bombast that characterized Hitler's public persona sharply contrasted with the private despair pervading his inner sanctum. As the Soviet bullets surged closer, engulfing the city above in flames, the psychological toll encapsulated the devastating humanity encompassing the war's final chapters. However, what followed in the aftermath of Hitler's demise proved equally significant, particularly regarding the handling, or rather the mishandling, of his remains. The bodies of Hitler and Braun were taken outside the bunker to a garden, where the charred remains were hastily buried, recounting a bizarre footnote in the annals of military history that would inspire decades of speculation and intrigue. By ordering their bodies destroyed, the Führer sought to prevent the spectacle of a public autopsy, akin to that of Benito Mussolini, whose dead body was displayed for public humiliation. This act reveals the extent to which Hitler understood symbolism. Even in death, he sought to control the narrative. Nonetheless, this attempt at controlling the posthumous legacy faltered, leading to uncertainty about the facts surrounding his end. The Soviets, having captured Berlin, became embroiled not just in conventional military governance, but in a propaganda war centered around the legacy of the harmful ideologies that had just escalated humanity's darkest chapters. In May 1945, Stalin ordered the recovery of Hitler's remains, apprehensive of the ramifications if conspiracy theories of Hitler's survival persisted. The meticulous measures employed to conceal and investigate the remnants reflected both a desire to thwart rumors of survival and an understanding of how narratives surrounding leadership impact ideologies long after the individuals who forged them have departed. As Soviet medical teams dissected the charred fats of the dictator carefully, each operation revealed not only the physical truth of history, but the realities of political machinations during the early Cold War. What transpired next became a critical moment in this interplay between historical fact and interpretation. The secretive nature of the Soviet handling of Hitler's body led to a disjointed narrative that fed conspiracy theories. Official accounts claimed the remains were cremated and the ashes scattered. Yet decades later, fragments surfaced that sparked renewed interest and skepticism. The divide between Western and Eastern narratives derived not only from propaganda, but fed deeper ideological divides amid the emerging Cold War. This environment stoked the embers of fascination surrounding Hitler, as myths began to craft their own space in collective memory, leaving the man himself shrouded in ambiguity. Historians debated the implications of these events extensively, acknowledging how the battlefield decisions and personal choices transformed the course of history. The systemic failures of command and the deeply personal tragedies culminated in a multifaceted portrait of Hitler that traversed military, political, and psychological spheres. The aftermath of these conclusions showcases the ripple effects of leadership paradigms, pitting ideological ideals against the human condition. The war, once the stage of grand strategies, left an imprint on the souls of those who witnessed its grotesque unfolding. As tales of bravery, resistance, and moral failure rise from the ashes of war, the enduring struggles of humanity elevate the complexity of memory and accountability. The echoes of political discord and personal anguish haunt the narratives unearthed in this turbulent history. The psychological scars left behind remind us that beyond the figures and strategies, it is ultimately individual humanity that shapes our understanding of the past. Through exploration of both the micro and macro scales during this catastrophic chapter, we begin to engage with the nuances of history, acknowledging that even those whose legacies are rooted in evil may provoke discussion about the darker sides of human nature and authority. This exploration ultimately reflects the continual struggle for peace and understanding in a world irrevocably affected by a single person's catastrophic choice, raising questions we must grapple with long after the dust has settled. As World War II drew to a close in Europe in May 1945, the management and interpretation of Adolf Hitler's remains emerged not only as a logistical challenge, but also as a theater of political machinations and psychological warfare that underscored the complexity of a post-war Europe. Various narratives surrounding the fate of Hitler's body converged in a fog of secrecy, deception, and ideological propaganda, predominantly emanating from Soviet sources. The early days following the Führer's demise were dictated by the overwhelming need of the Allied powers to ascertain physical proof of Hitler's death and to dispel any lingering rumors of his escape, which could galvanize the remnants of the Nazi regime. In the bunker of the Reich Chancellery, a doomed citadel of power, Hitler's final hours were marred by despair. As the Red Army's unyielding advance halted German resistance in Berlin, loyalty among the ranks was fraying amidst the relentless bombardment. The decision made by Hitler to marry Eva Braun just hours before their joint suicides encapsulated the tragic irony of their fates, reflecting the deeply personal choices made in an atmosphere of institutional collapse. In stark contrast to the meticulous strategies that defined the war years, this final act was steeped in a chaotic mix of desperation and defiance. Soldiers under Hitler's direct command faced unfathomable moral choices, as many realized their adherence to a crumbling ideology that had led millions to their deaths. The tension within Nazi ranks became palpable during Hitler's final hours, with officers debating the best course of action under extreme duress, while it remains unclear if they grasped the full implications of their leader's death or the continued fight against the Allies. Post-suicide, the immediate logistics of handling Hitler's body exposed the grim reality that enveloped those who had served him. Following the suicides, Otto Gunsche, Hitler's personal aide, alongside other high-ranking officials, executed a hastily concocted plan to dispose of the bodies at the behest of their frantic leader. The carcasses of Hitler and Eva Braun were transported outside the Führer bunker and placed in a shell crater near the Chancellery, where they were doused with petrol and ignited, an act meant to obliterate any trace left for adversaries to exploit. However, this deeply symbolic disposal effort was marred by tactical failings. The fire did not completely erase the remains, leading to the eventual surfacing of fragments that would fuel conspiracy theories for generations to come. As the Allies rolled into Berlin, their initial focus was on military strategy and securing one of the last pockets of Nazi resistance. Soviet commanders, eager to claim complete control of the city, had other priorities. Driven by the desire to uncover any trace of Hitler, Soviet forces dispatched intelligence units to meticulously sift through the chaotic wreckage of the city. Reports began to emerge almost immediately regarding the recovery of charred remains in the charred vicinity of the Chancellery. The swift transition of the narrative from battlefield to basement led to a calculated consolidation of power. The Soviet leadership, embodied in Joseph Stalin's resolute control, sought to leverage Hitler's death as a propaganda point, emphasizing the invincibility of the Red Army and the ideological downfall of fascism. The subsequent handling of the remains in the Soviet Union underscored this strategic manipulation. Despite public declarations asserting complete transparency regarding their discovery, the Kremlin clandestinely transported pieces of Hitler's skull and jawbone, which bore the marks of gunfire, to Moscow. These would eventually be displayed as grisly trophies in a so-called Museum of the Great Patriotic War. The deliberate obscurity surrounding these materials generated an environment of speculation, prompting various historians and enthusiasts to question the authenticity of the Soviet claims, especially when contrasted with contradicting narratives emerging from Western sources. Tactically, the decision to conceal the nature and location of the remains became as critical as the initial handling of their disposal. Fascination with Hitler extended into the realm of the macabre, as conspiracies flourished, suggesting he had survived and escaped to South America. These narratives, built upon thin threads of conjecture, became a poignant reflection of collective trauma, speaking not only to the enduring dread that fascist ideologies instilled, but also to a climate of disbelief that characterized post-war processing of trauma. Meanwhile, the Soviet stance continued to shift, oscillating between claims of complete eradication of fascist ideology and relying upon German war crimes as a justification for their own consolidation of power in Eastern Europe. In a chilling confluence of political theater and historical accountability, heated debates emerged among the key figures of the Allied leadership regarding the nature of the Soviet Union's role in post-war governance. As the lines of demarcation solidified, ideologies clashed. Stalin's authoritarian regime against the backdrop of democracy's fragile emergence in the West. Tensions solidified further as Western leaders began proclaiming the need for transparency in the handling of war crimes and reconstruction efforts. However, the reality of knowledge distribution became fragmentary, locked behind the Iron Curtain, retaining the air of mystery surrounding Hitler's demise and creating a veil over the human cost of the war. The impact of wartime decisions reverberated through both the corridors of power and the hearts of ordinary individuals. Many soldiers and civilians, having endured untold horrors during the war, now found themselves grappling with the psychological scars of a world irrevocably altered. The repercussions of Hitler's death became more than a mere footnote in military history. They reflected the broader human struggle to comprehend the costs of loyalty to tyranny. Individual narratives emerged from the ashes, each recounting a struggle with grief, remorse, and the haunting question of whether they had done enough against the oppressive tide of fascism. As the war transitioned from combat to commentary, the narratives of those left behind began weaving a rich tapestry of complexity, depicting acts of valor, cowardice, hope, and despair. This examination of Hitler's final days, indeed, transcends the parameters of a military decision, revealing a multifaceted puzzle comprised of ethics, loyalty, and the haunting shadows of history. The continued discourse surrounding his body's fate speaks to the broader narrative of renewal and reckoning in a world irrevocably influenced by personal choices made at the precipice of destruction. Ultimately, the conversations surrounding the authentic legacy of figures like Hitler revolve around more than the physical remnants of a once formidable figure. They challenge society's engagement with the dichotomies of good and evil, the nature of leadership, and the scars of violence that remain etched into the experience of humanity. These reflections become not only a testament to the past, but also a contemplative exploration of our present and future, urging essential dialogue around memory, accountability, and the enduring quest for justice in a world scarred by tyrannical legacies. As World War II drew to its harrowing conclusion, the fate of Adolf Hitler and the implications of his death began to unfold against a backdrop dominated by desperation and strategic military maneuvers. The final days of the Third Reich were characterized by frantic decision-making and a haunting urgency, as Russian forces advanced on Berlin, leading to an inevitable collapse of Hitler's regime. By April 1945, the remnants of the Nazi military were frantically trying to stave off the advancing Soviet troops, but the encirclement of Berlin was complete. The city became a crucible, where strategic breakdowns met the grim reality of impending loss. Within the Führer bunker, Hitler and his close circle wrestled not only with military failures, but also with their own personal demons, each grappling with the enormity of what they had orchestrated over the previous 12 years. On April 30, 1945, as Russian artillery thundered outside the bunker, Hitler chose to end his life rather than face the humiliation of capture. His suicide was emblematic of a regime built on an ethos of unwavering loyalty to the Führer. Those who remained with him in those final moments also met their ends, their fates intertwined with his. Among them was Eva Braun, his longtime companion, who joined him in death, thus sealing the tragic end of a surreal and toxic narrative woven through the fabric of German and European history. The act of entering the annals of history through self-inflicted destruction exemplified the ultimate betrayal of their own ideals, as the promise of a 1,000-year Reich crumbled into a smoking ruin on the very streets it had once sought to dominate. Following Hitler's death, the logistical nightmare of disposal began. The instructions left to burn his body were executed by Heinrich Himmler, the last of allies who held access to the final resting subtexts of Nazism. In the chaos that enveloped Berlin, the body was hastily cremated in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, a makeshift endeavor overshadowed by the urgency and confusion of the surrounding battles. The physical act of incineration held great symbolic weight. It was an attempt to preempt an odious cult of personality that had surrounded Hitler, a fervent wish to obliterate any potential martyrdom that could arise from this figure whose charisma had once hypnotized millions. But the bodies of Joseph Goebbels and his wife, along with their children, were a part of this macabre ritual of absolution, a twisted reverence for their shared demise amidst the ashes of their crumbling dreams. However, the subsequent discovery of these charred remains ignited a frenzy of speculation, logistical challenges, and political maneuvering. As the Allies liberated territories across Europe, conflicting narratives regarding the authenticity of the Führer's death emerged. This uncertainty seeped into the public consciousness, allowing conspiracy theories to flourish, even as Cold War tensions arose. The Soviet Union initially claimed to have Hitler's remains, but considerable misinformation surrounded their ownership and the very nature of the evidence presented to the West. The tension resulting from competing narratives did much to prolong the discussion about not only Hitler's ultimate fate, but also the ethical implications of his ideology, an echo reverberating within the territories that had borne the brunt of Nazi tyranny. The Soviets' control over the narrative concerning the remains stemmed from their desire to shape public perception regarding their role in the war and the character of their most adversarial foes. During the subsequent years, the body fragments were subject to intense scrutiny and analysis. Pathologists engaged in a complex forensic investigation that aimed to establish the legitimacy of the remains, including dental records obtained from Nazi officials exhumed in 1946. The bizarre geopolitical chessboard allowed the myth of Hitler, a relic capable of being resurrected in the minds of conspirators and sympathizers, to thrive amidst the whispers of the Iron Curtain that was swiftly descending across Europe. The human cost of the war extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the fall of Berlin, reaching into the very essence of recovery across war-torn nations. Survivors of the regime, now burdened with guilt and story, became emblematic of the overarching challenges faced by individuals attempting to reconcile their role during the wartime years. Soldiers, civilians, and former party members struggled with memories that often juxtaposed valor against complicity, and the attempt to navigate a world that had transformed into a landscape littered with death and moral ambiguities became a collective nightmare. The fallout from Hitler's actions, the destruction of communities, the genocide of millions, and the obliteration of entire countries echoed in the hollow spaces left in the lives of those who remained to build anew. These fractured existences were often painted over with broader strokes of propaganda, each faction attempting to shape their narratives in the face of history. The Allies heralded the fall of fascism, presenting their victory as moral justification for the devastation endured. Yet within their ranks, arguments burgeoned about how best to treat the captured remnants of the Nazi regime, debates that intensified over war crimes, tribunals which sought to address the accountability of the very perpetrators of horror. Nuremberg represented a harsh reminder that justice would not be a mere extension of physical might against tyranny. Instead, it sought to unmask the systemic evils propagated under the veil of leadership and loyalty. As these monumental ethical questions lingered, the logistical implications of documenting and examining the remains of the Reich's leadership remained. The quest for historical clarity remained intertwined with the palpable emotional weight carried by those who had lost loved ones, homes, and countries. The specter of Hitler's ideology, and how a singular vision could oscillate between fervent loyalty and mass destruction, marked the transition from military decisions to socio-political curricula of resistance and remembrance in the face of insufferable loss. Bearing this in mind, the future of Europe transformed into a matrix of possible narratives, each challenging the legacies inscribed within history. Following the ravages of the war, nations found themselves faced with rebuilding not only their physical infrastructures, but also the mere fabric of society, leading to a cautious dialogue around advancing democracy as an antidote to the venom of totalitarian ideologies. These discussions eventually led to new treaties and cooperative strategies meant to prevent such an unholy alliance of tyranny from ever manifesting anew. The future lay before them, steeped in the shadows of Hitler's lifeless remains, but also in the resilience of those who sought to shape a new era born from the ashes. The death of Adolf Hitler was far more than the end of an individual. It was a critical juncture that raised questions about human nature, the implications of power, and the responsibilities borne by those who lived through one of history's darkest epochs. Each of these threads, intertwining with the narratives of individual stories, illustrated that while the book on the war may have closed, the chapters on its impact would unfold for generations to come, demanding reflection and dialogue around justice, memory, and the undying struggle for a better world. As these discussions continue, we invite you, our viewers, to explore further the complexities of history as it unfolds. Consider subscribing for more detailed examinations that delve into the forgotten aspects of conflict, and share your suggestions for themes that intrigue you most. What remnants of history do you feel deserve to be uncovered next? As the dust settled over Berlin in early May 1945, The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and despair. The city lay in ruins, its once proud monuments reduced to rubble, a palpable testament to the ferocity of the battles that raged in its streets. On the surface, it was the end of the Third Reich, a swift and bloody conclusion to what historians would soon deem a catastrophic misadventure for a nation gripped by fascism and militarism. However, beneath this facade of apparent clarity lurked a web of complexities, particularly concerning the fate of Adolf Hitler's body, a topic shrouded in secrecy and misinformation that would only add to the legend and mystique surrounding the Führer. In the days leading up to Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, the command structure of the German army faced utter collapse. As the Red Army encroached from the east, the remnants of the Wehrmacht found themselves outmatched and outgunned, leading to frantic last-ditch efforts to stave off overwhelming defeat. Fueled by a dogged sense of loyalty, some of Hitler's inner circle refused to abandon him, even as the inevitable became clear. The tight-knit camaraderie of his final days in the Führer bunker was marked by an atmosphere of paranoia and desperation, intensified by the rapid advance of Soviet forces. It was here, amid the chaos of impending doom, that the historical narrative begins to spin into darker territories, making the subsequent treatment of Hitler's body an emblem of the ambiguity that framed the twilight of Nazi leadership. Following the suicide, Hitler's charred remains, to be recognized historically as both a symbolic assertion and a logistical problem, prompted immediate considerations among the remnants of his circle, most notably Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler. The desire to eliminate anything that could perpetuate his corpse as a relic for future generations of devotees was paramount, an echo of a long-standing sentiment among Nazi officials to hide the evidence of their failures and atrocities. The decision to incinerate his body, along with that of Eva Braun, was thus both a tactical measure aimed at obliterating the physical manifestation of the Führer's legacy and a reflection of the ceaseless devotion that had characterized his regime. The burning of Hitler's body in the garden of the Reich Chancellery was executed with urgent precision. A hastily assembled team, aware of the approaching Soviet troops, utilized gasoline and pyrotechnics to perform this last rite in a grotesque act of altars and ashes, as the flames danced in the twilight of a crumbling empire. Meanwhile, nearby, the battle for Berlin raged on, with Soviet soldiers squarely focused on defeating the remaining German defenses, emphasizing the frantic race against time that ultimately dictated the fate of the Nazi hierarchy. When Soviet forces finally encountered the remnants of the Third Reich, their first orders were rigorous: conquer the ruins and secure any documentation that could serve as tangible evidence of the atrocities committed, including the remnants of the leadership that had orchestrated them. The chaotic aftermath of the battle for Berlin quickly saw Hitler's corpse become a subject of immense interest to Soviet intelligence. In an era where information was weaponized, the Soviets were keen to exploit every scrap of lore surrounding Hitler's demise to diminish the legacy of fascism and circumscribe any potential resurgence of Nazi sentiment within the populace. The smoke of the burning corpse had barely dissipated when the Red Army captured evidence suggesting the twist of fate encircling Hitler's demise, that the Führer had indeed succumbed to his mortality. Over the ensuing days, various accounts emerged, each one competing for truth amid the propaganda battleground, indicating that haunting memories of Hitler were far from extinguished, even in death. In the weeks that followed, the body intrigued Moscow, who undertook the delicate task of weaving a narrative that would suit their political aims. Witnesses would recount seeing German civilians scouring the remnants of the city for physical tokens of power, while others began to formulate their own stories regarding Hitler's last moments, and what each account might mean for a population grappling with a rapidly shifting political reality. This flurry of stories, some sensationalized, others born from genuine fear, became the fabric of a burgeoning mythos that would take years to untangle. Throughout Soviet circles, a clandestine operation was set into motion. The infamous Smersh, the military counterintelligence unit, was deployed to gather evidence. The decision to keep Hitler's remains under wraps was strategic. If a recognizable specimen of Hitler could be apprehended, it would signify an unquestionable definitive end to his reign, a precursor to dismantling any cult of personality that might arise, as was often floated in the doctrine of Marxist-Leninism, centered around the figurehead. The clandestine recovery of remains, initially concealed and later transferred to a series of secure locations, evinced the calculated maneuvers on the part of Soviet officials, fearful that the mere whispered suggestion of reverence might fuel ideologies once again. Reports emerged that the body was exhumed by Soviet authorities in 1970, with parts of it subjected to scientific scrutiny. Skeletal remains were studied, and significant portions were interred beneath layers of concrete in an effort to bury the narrative of the past once and for all, encapsulating the dramatic tension surrounding Hitler's lingering specter, even in death. The need to obliterate his legacy contrasted with the fact that his ideological tenets continued to seep into the socio-political fabric of Europe, serving as a fatalistic reminder of the potency of fascist ideologies when allowed to fester unchecked. The burden of history is profound. It hinges on understanding how woven narratives and lost truths contribute to the consciousness of nations. The relentless pursuit of knowledge regarding Hitler's last days, the manner of his death, and the machinations that surrounded his body reflect a society learning to come to terms with a legacy soaked in violence and totalitarianism. For future generations, this inquiry would reflect not just historical curiosity, but also the perpetual struggle against the return of oppressive regimes and the fight for human rights, a fight that would be cultivated through remembrance. As the years unfolded, the impact of World War II's decision-makers felt not just within the haunted cities of Europe, but resonated through cultural awareness on a global scale. The resonant echoes of this dark chapter in history, symbolized and encapsulated in the cruel drama of a corpse left for the ages, demanded a conscientious examination of the values and actions undertaken in the pursuit of power, empathy, and the pursuit of peace. A reminder that history is not merely a chronicle of past endeavors, but a reflective lens through which one must navigate the present. The dichotomy of horror and hope found within the narratives surrounding Hitler's death ultimately draws forth a compelling argument for a thorough reckoning with history, crafting a world where such tyrannies may never again take root. As international intelligence agencies scrambled to piece together the narrative surrounding Adolf Hitler's demise in May 1945, the logistics of his final days within the confines of the Führer bunker began to emerge, illuminating the grim reality faced by both the Nazi leadership and the beleaguered German populace. The relentless advance of Soviet forces into Berlin had not only shattered the last vestiges of resistance, but also deepened the psychological despair engulfing those who still pledged allegiance to the Third Reich. Trapped in a crumbling sanctuary of power, Hitler's desperation became palpable both inside the bunker and throughout the city above, where artillery barrages echoed as harrowing reminders of impending defeat. In examining tactics, both military and psychological, it is essential to note that Hitler, increasingly isolated from reality, remained steadfast in his delusions of victory, despite the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise. Facing imminent encirclement, he was surrounded by loyalists and sycophants whose collective denial rendered them incapable of confronting the truth. This dangerous blend of tactical naivete and unwavering ideological allegiance exemplified the disarray within the German military command, a command that once boasted the acumen of seasoned tacticians, now reduced to a desperate scramble for survival. With robust intelligence coming in from the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union's strategy to encircle and crush Berlin was executed with precision. General Georgy Zhukov, a prominent architect of Soviet success, understood that Berlin was not merely a political capital, but the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany. By deploying nearly 2.5 million troops and employing extensive aerial bombardment, the Red Army initiated Operation Berlin, a formidable assault aimed at closing the vise on the remnants of German resistance. Amid this tactical chaos, the people of Berlin were unwittingly becoming entangled in a drama that exemplified the brutality of war. Their turmoil mirrored the fate of the Führer, illustrating the psychological landscape of a populace long indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, yet now facing the grim realization that their leaders had led them into cataclysm. As supplies dwindled and food rationing deepened despair, accounts of civilians, cut off from the outside world and facing bombardments with increasing frequency, highlighted a stark human toll that overshadowed even the gory play of military maneuvers. As the Red Army advanced, defenders of the city found themselves increasingly desperate, attempting to hold the line with increasingly improvised defenses. Civilians, too, were thrust into the conflict, many taking up arms in futile attempts to defend their city against a relentless foe. This fact underscores the tragic reality of war, wherein the dichotomy between soldier and civilian frequently dissolves, blurring the lines of responsibility and complicity in conflict. As it became apparent that surrender was inevitable, Hitler's final decisions carried with them the weight of desperation. Sequestered in the bunker, he presided over an atmosphere steeped in paranoia and fatalism. He dished out orders with a firmness rooted in denial rather than military practicality. Notably, his insistence on fighting to the last man led to a futile defense among the remaining forces, further exacerbating the loss of life among civilians trapped within the besieged city. This moment encapsulated the tragic paradox of totalitarian regimes. An unyielding adherence to ideology often overshadowed the core value of human life, ultimately laying bare the gnawing dissonance that characterizes such systems. Even as the Red Army closed in on the city, the fate of Hitler's body was discussed among a small circle of his closest aides. The discussions ranged from attempts to incinerate his remains, effectively covering up the narrative of his death, to the dispatch of loyal guards tasked with ensuring that the legacy of the functionary was not captured or desecrated by the captors. These impulses speak volumes about the lengths to which individuals would go to protect the image and ideology of a regime that had long since collapsed, revealing a complex interplay between loyalty, fear, and the need for historical ambiguity, a phenomenon where the stakes became both metaphysical and corporeal. Logging the implosion of a regime, the hesitance to accept finality is a lingering aspect of totalitarian governance, where the scars left behind are often inscribed into the psyche of a nation grappling with its past. High-ranking officers such as Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, clinging to the final assumptions of their fading reign, attempted to maintain an aura of control amid chaos. Yet the hubris surrounding Hitler's supposed invincibility and his insistence on orchestrating a defense that had become untenable reflected the collapse of reason in an environment where rational judgment had long become obscured. The ill-fated orders to persist in a fight for a lost cause culminated in nights filled with deafening shell fire and heart-wrenching cries that echoed against the walls of the bunker, even as Hitler's health visibly deteriorated under the mounting stress. Ironically, while the Führer was taking his final actions, the age-old patterns of allegiance and betrayal played out dramatically among his ranks. Desperation drove many to abandon their posts, navigate treacherous paths of survival, or even join forces with the very enemy they had so fervently opposed. The overarching theme of human struggle within the context of war would soon become a principal concern for the victors and survivors. The Russian advance decimated opposition, but the psychological scars and moral disarray it revealed within Germany's complicated societal structure would remain long after the final gunfire faded. Upon Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, the aftermath carried implications far beyond the confines of the bunker walls. The clandestine disposal of his remains, the burning of his corpse in the Chancellery Garden, served a dual purpose. It aimed to prevent any display of his body by advancing Soviet forces, reflecting a final tragic irony in his failed ambition for an immortal legacy. This act would lead to darkness in the following decades, where Moscow, shrouded by an aura of secrecy, meticulously crafted the narrative concerning the Führer's remains. It became imperative for Soviet leadership to control the truth behind his death, positioning an official version that absolved the regime from any culpability and fortified their narrative against fascism. As various factions sought to disentangle the secrets woven into the tapestry of history, the truth about Hitler's death and the fate of his body held tremendous implications for the new world order emerging from the ashes of World War II. The realities of war, characterized by brutality, betrayal, and the tragic loss of humanity, formed the crucible in which the essence of power, ideology, and the human spirit perpetually clashed. The arc of history, both revelatory and shrouded in secrecy, serves as a stark reminder of the lessons ingrained in the rubble of a fallen regime. It bridges the chasm between personal suffering and larger socio-political dynamics. The echoes of past turmoil compel nations to grapple with their nightmares, each iteration urging the world to confront the past with honesty, lest it be doomed to repeat it in a future fraught with the same solitary traps of ideology and oppression. As the final days of the Third Reich unraveled, the gravity of the situation transcended mere military tactics. The last stand of the German forces in Berlin presented an intricate tableau of desperation. In the face of imminent defeat, the Wehrmacht was pieced together from remnants. Soldiers, often fatigued and demoralized, clung to a fractured ideology that had once promised supremacy. Surrender was not an option. Instead, they entrenched themselves within the bunker, becoming unwilling participants in a tragic narrative that spiraled toward oblivion. The Soviet forces, buoyed by the determination of their commanders, executed meticulous operations to encircle the capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov orchestrated a relentless assault, leveraging the inescapable encirclement to apply crippling pressure on the defending troops. The Red Army advanced with overwhelming firepower. Heavy artillery and tanks like the T-34 bulldozed through the city's defenses, reducing the remnants of the Nazi war machine to rubble. Within this military maelstrom, the human element remained paramount. Civilians trapped in the city bore the brunt of the violence as Soviet forces advanced toward the heart of Berlin. The air was thick with despair, and the once thriving metropolis became a haunting landscape of destruction and chaos. The populace witnessed a disintegration of normalcy. The psychological toll of the unfolding disaster etched deep scars on the survivors. Families were torn apart, dreams were extinguished, and futures extinguished in the clash of steel and resolve. For many, the experience was a juxtaposition of the civilization they once knew against the grim reality encroaching upon them like a nightmarish tide, rendering them mere pawns in a grand geopolitical chess game. Hitler himself, ensconced within the echoing vaults of the Führer bunker, faced a stark reckoning. Surrounded by dilapidated versions of his formerly robust command structure, he made the fateful decision to end his life. This act was not merely personal, but emblematic of the totality of defeat that enveloped the Nazi regime. In the hours that followed Hitler's suicide, Eva Braun, his longtime companion, chose similarly, further solidifying the notion that even in the depths of despair, their demise was a culmination of choices steeped in the dark ideology they had propagated. Following their deaths, a calculated set of decisions was made regarding the handling of their remains. The choice to incinerate the bodies was fraught with tactical implications. It was not merely a desperate effort to obliterate the physical evidence, but a strategic move rooted in the fear of ritualistic glorification by their enemies. It was anticipated that had the Soviets discovered Hitler's body intact, it would provide them with a trophy to use as propaganda against Nazism. Thus, the charred remnants were hastily buried in a makeshift grave and executed under the veils of secrecy that continued to shroud events occurring in the waning days of the war. The bodies were doused in petrol and set ablaze in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, but the ashes of the Führer and his consort would linger long after the flames extinguished. The remains were then hidden carefully, an action permeated with fear and foreboding. Fear of Hitler's legacy lingering in some ghostly form to ignite future fanatical movements, and foreboding at the burgeoning power dynamics shaping post-war Europe. News of Hitler's death leaked quickly, resulting in bewildered reactions across the globe. The uncertainty surrounding the fate of his body ignited fervor within the ranks of not only Germans still clinging to the remnants of the Nazi ideal, but among the Allied forces too. Many anticipated the emergence of relics that might almost sanctify his rule, trophies that could potentially bolster extremist movements, which, despite being vanquished, had not been fully exercised from European soil. The American forces, seeing strategic advantage in possessing definitive evidence of Hitler's demise, raced to Berlin with equal measures of caution and urgency. It was no longer merely the physical presence of the dictator that mattered, but the psychological dimensions enveloping his legacy that warranted scrupulous examination. Moscow, anxious to assert control over the narrative, seized upon the scattered remnants of Hitler's legacy to weave its own story, carefully crafted and tightly controlled. The crew dispatched by the Soviet Union tasked with recovering the remains faced significant political maneuvering, as there were concerns of both revealing classified information and manipulating historical narratives. Imported into the fold of Soviet propaganda was the idea that Hitler's death represented not only the end of a regime, but the triumph of the Soviet state, a claim meant to reinforce party legitimacy and the legitimacy of its actions during the conflict. Unbeknownst to the world, the true fate of Hitler's remains became a well-guarded secret, concealed from the prying eyes of both the public and the military. The remnants were moved, transported through a labyrinth of secrecy, and ultimately buried beneath the soil of a remote location in East Germany. The maneuver illustrated a central facet of the Soviet strategy. Obfuscation and disinformation were critical to shaping historical narratives as they sought to insulate their regime from charges of complicity and to bolster their image as avengers of fascism. The lingering shadow of Hitler's demise would play a significant role in shaping the discourse of post-war Europe. The effort to control the narrative extended far beyond mere possession of physical remains. It cultivated an atmosphere ripe for myth-making. As the geopolitical landscape shifted, the legacy of fascism became intertwined with issues surrounding justice and accountability. The Nuremberg trials emerged as a crucial platform for addressing the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Yet the questions surrounding the fate of its most notorious leader loomed large, casting a pall over the proceedings. Was the tyrant truly gone? How would the world come to reconcile the absence of both man and myth? Thus, as the dust settled over Berlin and the cacophony of gunfire quieted to mere echoes, the true challenges of reconstruction, both physical and ideological, began. The mythos of Hitler became an empty vessel into which future narratives could be poured. His actual remains had dissipated, yet his ghost lived on, haunting the collective consciousness of a world still grappling with the specter of totalitarianism. The inextricable bond between history's cruel realities and the complexities of human emotion continued to unfold, compelling nations and individuals alike to face their histories with an unflinching gaze. The dynamics birthed from World War II lingered, influencing behaviors, policies, and existential inquiries long after the last throes of conflict had ebbed away. Mirroring a profound truth, history does not simply adhere to the timeline of events, but weaves itself through the psyche of humanity, forever shaping its future. As the conclusive chapters of World War II unfolded, the fate of Adolf Hitler's remains emerged as a peculiar intersection between military strategy, psychological warfare, and the geopolitics of a continent in upheaval. The death of the Führer marked not the end of fascism, but rather the inception of an intense battle for narrative control, where visceral human experience tangled with the meticulous machinations of statecraft. As the Allied forces coalesced around Berlin, each faction recognized the symbolic significance of Hitler's demise, not just for the Germans still clinging to the vestiges of the Nazi regime, but for people around the globe who would either seek to remember him as a cautionary tale or mythologize his figure as one of defiance. Within the Berlin bunker, among scattered papers and the remnant echoes of desperate decisions, Hitler's final hours were emblematic of the fragility of power. Commanding generals and loyalists could only stand witness to the deteriorating reality of a war long lost. The once feared dictator had become a specter of his former self, clouded in delusion, yet resolute in his resolve to control even in his dying moments. Strategic assessments were rendered moot, as smoke rose from the ruins of the Reichstag, and the sound of artillery rattled the buildings of a crumbling metropolis. It was here that Hitler, facing imminent defeat, chose to end his life. a decision that would amplify the mythos surrounding his figure long past his mortal exit. His final act, a synthesized blend of desperation and defiance, left an indelible mark not just on Berlin, but upon the entire post-war discourse. Following Hitler's suicide, as Soviet troops advanced through the ravaged city, the issue of his body became one of both urgency and philosophical deliberation for the Allies, particularly for the Soviet leadership, who were acutely aware of the propaganda potential the Führer's demise presented. The grisly task of disposing of his remains became emblematic of a broader strategy to extinguish what remained of Nazi ideological fervor. In an intricate ballet of subterfuge, Soviet operatives sought to ensure that any remnants of Hitler's existence would be eradicated from the material world, entwining the fate of his body within the political narrative that the newly rising Soviet power wished to construct. Under the pretext of gathering evidence for war crimes, Red Army soldiers scoured the remnants of the Führer's final stronghold, determined to recover his remains. Their operation was underscored by the persistent need to maintain a facade of comprehensive defeat over the Nazi regime, to affirm that not even the ashes of their leader would live on to inspire future generations. The practical realities of wartime operations, married with the psychological imperative to contain the fascist menace, dictated that the Soviets needed not only to eliminate Hitler's physical form, but also to manage the narrative surrounding his death. The chaos of Berlin in May 1945 came with its own logistical challenges, as the city itself was a tortured landscape marred by rubble, violence, and a stark realization of the past's atrocities. Among the ruins, the Soviets managed to locate the charred remnants of Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies, an endeavor steeped in tactical precision even amidst the broader operational discord. The decision to burn the bodies and dispose of the ashes, a decision made with the utmost secrecy, was both a tactical achievement and a public relations maneuver, ensuring that there would be no grave for Heil Hitler's followers to rally around. In this way, the Soviets aimed to dismantle not just the physical figure of Hitler, but to dismantle the larger-than-life ideation of Nazi leadership. The remains were interred in various clandestine locations, shifting as the political tides turned and international scrutiny sharpened. Such maneuvers, however, reflect a broader understanding of the psychological dynamics at play. The political power of myth is profound, and the Allies, in attempting to assert control over the narrative, inadvertently cemented Hitler's symbolic influence post-mortem. In the beginning phases of reconstruction, the fractured visage of Europe grappled with the weight of atrocities inscribed within its borders, while simultaneously confronting the practical necessities of rebuilding a new order. The Nuremberg trials became an embodiment of this struggle, an attempt to codify justice within a framework that acknowledged the horrors of the past while looking towards the future. Yet the specter of Hitler lingered, rendering the proceedings a duality of seeking retribution, while confronting an unsettling void left in the absence of a tangible representation of the enemy. At the trials, the Allied prosecutors faced disbelief and cynicism, not just from the remnants of the Nazi leadership on trial, but from a world grappling with its own complicity in fascism. The absence of Hitler cast a long shadow over the proceedings, facilitating a multitude of narratives through which individuals and nations sought to articulate their experiences and stances. Post-conflict, the discussions around accountability and justice could not simply adhere to the formal structures established at Nuremberg. They required a cultural reckoning that engaged with the philosophical implications of power, moral failing, and human choice. Amidst this, various factions within the Soviet Union began propagating a narrative delineating their role as the primary avengers of fascism. By asserting that the Soviet troops had not only defeated the physical enemy, but had also metaphorically vanquished the spirit of fascism represented in Hitler, they carved a significant footprint in the evolving mythos. Such endeavors were riddled with contradictions, as the Soviet regime simultaneously engaged in its own series of oppressive measures, leading one to question the authenticity of their claim as liberators. The ensuing Cold War illuminated the complexities of remembrance, responsibility, and the narrative spun in the wake of conflict. Each nation grappled with its own interpretations of history, some embracing the myth of fascism's icon, while others aimed for a rationalization of their narratives that displaced the brutality of wartime actions. The impact of World War II and the disappearance of Hitler's physical remains thus melded into a paradoxical legacy, a reminder that while the war may have concluded, the stories we tell about that conflict, the figures within it, and the aftermath continue to influence political, social, and cultural dialogues globally. The very act of erasing a figure like Hitler from tangible existence triggered complex dialogues about memory and truth, thus fueling debates that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of a war. The social fabric of Europe was irrevocably altered, as former allies, enemies, and bystanders now faced the realities of a world unmoored from pre-war legacies, and the ghosts of conflict began to reshape the landscape of politics and identity across the continent. In this crucible of transformation, the echoes of war urged humanity to confront its legacy with a vigilant resolve, illuminating the truths that the shapes of power, memory, and morality had yet to define. Ultimately, the shadow cast by a figure once believed to be the embodiment of absolute evil continues to reverberate through history, a reminder that the human capacity for both destruction and redemption remains painfully intertwined. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the resolution concerning Adolf Hitler's body epitomized the complex entanglement of military strategy, political machinations, and psychological warfare, factors that would eventually shape the discourse surrounding his legacy. After his suicide on April 30, 1945, Hitler's physical remains became an object of intense interest, not only as a symbol of the Nazi regime's collapse, but also as a potential propaganda tool for the victors. This was a narrative laden with implications. For the Soviet Union, the need to mythologize their victory over fascism would weave Hitler's fate into the fabric of post-war identity politics. Hitler's death occurred amid a backdrop of military chaos as Soviet troops advanced relentlessly toward Berlin, culminating in an unwieldy urban battlefield where tactical decisions were dictated not just by the terrain, but by the overwhelming need for rapid, decisive action. Combat units faced the stark realities of urban warfare. Street fighting had reduced even the most seasoned soldiers to desperate conditions, reminiscent of earlier sieges seen in Stalingrad. Yet despite the overwhelming victory, logistical obstacles remained. Soviet forces had to contend with supplies running thin, the need for ammo and reinforcements, and a war-weary populace burdened by loss. The very final push into Berlin demanded an audacious blend of ferocity, powered by bitter memories of past defeats, all while trying to maintain discipline among troops who bore witness to their comrades falling to German counterattacks framed by desperation and distorted military strategy. As Soviet forces overran key positions in Berlin's city center, the frantic pace of battle tragically skewed any immediate plan regarding the handling of Hitler's corpse. News of Hitler's demise reached Soviet command, sowing panic fused with opportunism within the ranks. Amidst the sensation of victory, there was a continuous effort to grasp a symbolic hold over the remnants of the vanquished regime. Chief of the Soviet General Staff, General Antonov, pushed for an immediate directive. The remains must be secured to prevent ideological exploitation by any faction keen on resurrecting Hitler's image within political discourse. This urgency highlighted the delicate balancing act between military efficiency and intelligence operations, intertwined with the larger objectives of propaganda. In the frenzied aftermath, Hitler's corpse was clandestinely extracted from the Führer bunker by aide Otto Günsche and SS officer Ludwig Stumpfegger. They adhered closely to the chaotic beat of a retreating regime, racing against time to conceal not just a corpse, but the ideology it had represented. The body was taken to the nearby garden of the Reich Chancellery, a final resting place that bore witness to the regime's rise and fall. Here Hitler was doused in petrol and set ablaze alongside Eva Braun, his longtime companion, an act they believed would obliterate his physical form, a futile attempt to deny his legacy any tangible continuity. What remained, however, was a grotesque charred identity that shifted through the lens of Soviet scrutiny. The ashes were critical currency in the battle of narratives unfolding, as the victors sought to inscribe a definitive version of history. Through a shroud of secrecy and misinformation, as per Soviet protocol, a secondary layer of intrigue unfurled with the arrival of Soviet intelligence officers. Their objective was to both document and dispose of the remains that possessed almost mythical significance. The ashes were recovered, along with existing remnants of the bodies of other Nazi leaders, and subsequently transported back to Soviet territory. However, a high-stakes gamble ensued within the corridors of power. The remnants of the corpses were scattered across various locations, a deliberate tactic designed to invert any potential hero worship from extremists who might romanticize Hitler as a martyr. The operations concerning the bodies played into the larger Soviet strategy, which aimed to construct a narrative that bolstered their anti-fascist mythology. The Potsdam Conference saw the division of post-war Germany, an act layered with political tension. The discussions involved firm military alignments and territorial disputes among the Allied forces, while American and British leaders strove to forge a model of denazification. The Soviets pushed for a narrative where they were seen not merely as liberators, but as high priests of justice, demanding accountability for the war's atrocities while downplaying their own. Hitler's remains became a potent symbol, a reminder of the ideological war fought beyond the battlefield, but also a device in political maneuvering, allowing the Soviets to leverage power dynamics both in Europe and within their sphere of influence. In a strategic turn, Stalin authorized the systematic amalgamation of the various remains, with the intent of erasing Hitler's legacy entirely, stripping away any remnants of a physical idol. The remains were eventually buried in an unmarked grave, a deliberate obscuring designed to ensure that the figure synonymous with tyranny and madness became a specter rather than a cause célèbre. The cremation and interment were performed under the watchful eyes of Soviet spies, reaffirming their claim to having silenced the authoritarian utterances of the past. But these decisions were accompanied by broader ramifications shaped by the ideological schism of the Cold War. As the Soviets buried Hitler's remains, they simultaneously awakened a specter that would haunt the corridors of the new geopolitical landscape. The war had not just dealt in the currency of destruction, but it had also reshaped identities, fanning the flames of extremist ideologies on both sides. The impact of Hitler's erasure from history intertwined seamlessly with the human psyche. Western perception pivoted around a narrative of an eternal struggle against a revived dictatorship, fostering a complex discourse among nations torn between remembering and forgetting the past. Thus, in the shadow of Hitler's annihilation, the layers of historical narrative continued to unfurl, revealing not only the meticulous orchestration of war efforts, but also the very real human cost incurred, a deep, haunting legacy etched into the landscape of Europe. Soldiers left hollowed from conflict, civilians captivated by propaganda, and ideologies vehemently challenged remained prisoners of a history that was no longer just theirs to own, creating echoes that would ripple through generations. Ultimately, as new empires of thought rose amidst the ashes, the question remained haunting. In the mighty expanse of human conflict, who truly controls the narratives of history, and at what cost?